Morning, everyone. It's good to be here with you. I appreciate songs that were selected and also for Ray's thoughts, which he shared this morning. And, a lot of times those Lord's Supper talks are rightly so focused on the cross. And so you can consider this morning's lesson kind of an extension of that as we continue a series where we're going through the 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross. That when we look at all the different gospel narratives as they describe Jesus being crucified, we add up all the sayings that Jesus says from there that we have recorded. We actually end up with 7 of those. And I think that when we break it down and we look at each one, it will, in the end, provide us with a powerful lesson. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I did want to add real quick and just make it known, again, I'm good at embarrassing people from the pulpit, but Chuka's last Sunday is today, so that's all I'll say about it, but it's just been a pleasure having him, and I know I'm certainly going to miss him, and I think that I share that sentiment with everyone else, but we're going to stay in touch, so, and who knows, maybe you'll be back and our paths will cross again, but we wish him well as he heads to Uzbekistan. If you're wondering where that is, talk to him. I have no idea. But this will be his last Sunday, so make sure you get your goodbyes in while you can. With that being said, my grandpa growing up, when he would preach, I found that he would say the same things over and over and over again. And you come to realize that's intentional, that repetition is how we remember things. And so each lesson, I just want to remind us that this verse from Galatians 6 and verse 14, where Paul writes, "Far be it from me to boast." He can't boast in himself. He's a Christian. He's somebody that Christ died for, is the way that he sees it. And so if he's going to boast in everything, it's going to be the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. He says, "By which the whole world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." And to reiterate, what he's saying there is that through the cross of Jesus, Paul was a totally changed person. That the way he saw the world was different, and also the way in which the world saw Paul was different as well. And why is that? It is because of the cross of Jesus Christ. Not just what it accomplished, but what it really means when you begin to grasp the reasons for why Jesus did this and what it actually communicates to us as God's people. We find that there's really 2 essential things that I want us to be mindful of as we go through this that the cross reveals. That number 1, the cross reveals the great debt of my sin. That I'm such a sinner, I'm so lost and estranged from God because of my sin. And I am in such great spiritual debt that I have no chance of paying it off. And that it's so drastic, the situation that I'm in, that the only way to solve it was if God comes in the flesh and dies for me on the cross. And so when we look at that and consider that, we find that the cross reminds us to be humble. That when we really understand it, there is no pride as we stand before the cross of Jesus. There's no room for pride amongst God's people. But then the second thing we take away from that, because Jesus was willing to do that, as was brought out, his life wasn't taken from him. Jesus says, "I have authority to lay my life down. I have authority to take it up again." He went to the cross willingly for us. And that reveals to us then, as we look at the cross, the love of God for humanity. Despite our sinfulness, despite our debt, despite the great lengths that God had to go to reconcile us to him, he loves us, and he was willing to die for us. And so there's this paradox. As we stand before the cross of Jesus, we become extremely humble. The cross is extremely humbling. But then at the same time, as we stand before the cross of Jesus, we have this renewed sense of value and worth. And maybe you're somebody that feels like you aren't worth anything to anybody else. And I doubt that that is true, but the reality is, even if that is true, this is how much you are worth to the only being that really matters in the end. And that's God. You are worth so much to God that he came here and he died for you. And so that's what's so life-changing as we look at the cross. And so last week, before I get too ahead of myself, we looked at that phrase where Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." We come to the cross, we realize we're not alone, but we come to it realizing that we need forgiveness. And as we stand before the cross and we hear those words of Jesus, we discover nothing else but grace. And as we realize that we are subjects of such great amount of grace, we also realize that we are then compelled to extend that grace to the people in our lives. If God was willing to forgive me and go through so much so that I could be forgiven, then I need to be willing to go to great lengths to forgive others as well. This week, though, as we are looking at the seven sayings of Jesus, we're looking at that phrase that Jesus says to one of the thieves that was being crucified with him when he says, "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Before we get into that, I just want to remind us of the spectacle before us. That when you look at the cross, we find that this is an incredible event that is taking place. And as we're going to look at it today, we often have this tendency to compare ourselves to other people. It's very easy for me to compare myself, for better or worse, to those around me and to derive the ideas of myself from that. That sometimes I compare myself to those who are maybe a worse sinner than I am. Or maybe we compare ourselves to those who are poorer or of lower social status than us, or who have less power than us, or who are less successful than us. But as we come to the cross of Jesus, we learn that it really doesn't amount to anything to compare ourselves horizontally. That we come to this great spectacle and we discover who we are, not by comparing ourselves to one another, but by looking up at the cross of Jesus. And what we find is that the same thing that everybody else that day walked away thinking when we really begin to consider this. That this crucifixion, which took place over the span of about 6 hours, was this great spectacle. That's the word that Luke uses when it says in Luke 23 and verse 48 that all the crowds who came together for this spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return beating their breasts. I mean, just picture what Luke is describing, that people are so emotionally torn by what they've just witnessed that they're walking away physically beating at their chests because it was so traumatic, and I would submit that deep down they knew that something wrong had just transpired in what they had just witnessed. But that word that Luke uses, it was this spectacle. That word comes from the Greek word theoria, which is where we get our word in English for theater or theatrical. The idea here is that this was something to be watched. This was something to be beheld. This was something to concentrate upon. And it was this magnificent event in human history. If we really can look at what's taking place here, we can't help but walk away with the same emotional reaction that the people who were there that day had when they walked away and reflected on the spectacle that they had just witnessed. And so remember that this was a horrific and terrible way to die. That so terrible was crucifixion and death by crucifixion that it was reserved for the worst of the worst of the worst of criminals. So bad was the death of crucifixion that do you realize that those who were Roman citizens, by law, were not allowed to be crucified? And that's why historically we understand that Paul was beheaded. He wasn't crucified because he was technically a citizen of Rome. And so think about that they have a law. This death is so terrible that even the worst criminals in Rome, they said, well, if you're a citizen in Rome, you might have done some terrible things, but it's just not right for us to do that to one of our own people. This is how bad death by the cross truly was. And imagine just this great crowd that is gathered around Jesus, and there's all different types of people that make up that audience. A tiny fraction of that audience are some people that followed or were close to Jesus, primarily the women in Jesus' life. the female disciples, and it appears that John the disciple is one of the only of the 12 that is present that day watching this horrific scene unfold before his very eyes. Beyond them, you got people who are rich and are poor. You got those who were directly responsible for putting Jesus there. You have the scribes and the Pharisees evaluating what's going on. You have the rulers of Rome. You have Roman centurions. And all of them, for the most part, except for Jesus' intimate followers, all of them are hurling and casting insults, heaping up pain on the cross, adding salt to the wound. But there's two more individuals that we haven't focused on too much up to this point. That as Jesus hung there on the cross, sometimes we forget that he didn't hang there alone. And that's because he took the place of a man named Barabbas. There's some that think these two other criminals that Jesus was crucified next to, that they made up a trio, a band of individuals that got into trouble with one another. But in Luke chapter 23, and actually I think that citation that I have on the screen is from Matthew 27, verse 38. But in Matthew 27, verse 38, it tells us that two robbers were crucified with him. And Luke uses the word criminals. But this word for robbers is kind of an interesting one. These guys weren't just any, your typical robber who breaks in and waits for you to leave your home and by the cloak of darkness breaks in and steals a few valuable possessions. That when you do a word study on the word robber here, this is like the worst kind of robber that you can find. It's somebody that will jump on you in broad daylight, beat you to a pulp, and leave you left to be dead. It's the same word that's used in the story of the Good Samaritan. And in Luke chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus describes there in that parable, in that story, a man who was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers. These are people that were highway robbers and would wait for people unsuspecting to come across them, and they were alone, and they would jump them, beat them, strip them naked, and steal from them. And that's exactly what happens in this story Jesus describes, that these robbers stripped them, beat him, went away, leaving him half dead. It's the same word that is used to describe these two men hanging next to Jesus on the cross. It's the same word that's used to describe Barabbas. Remember that exchange where the reason Jesus is there is because they had this process where once a year they would release one of their criminals in exchange for somebody else. That ended up being Barabbas, and he's described as a robber, and elsewhere in the other Gospels it describes him as being in prison with the murderers who caused the rebellion. And we don't know exactly what that is, but there's hints of the idea that what went into this word and what these men were really guilty of was not just stealing from people, but violently stealing from people, murdering people, or at least physically harming people. It's the same word that Jesus himself uses in Matthew chapter 26. In verse 25, remember when Jesus, he sees this great group of people coming to arrest him, and he says, "Did you come out with swords and clubs as against a robber to capture me?" This is a word that's used where if you're going to arrest somebody that is this robber, as is used in the Greek, this is somebody that has to be restrained by force. And Jesus is saying, you've come out with swords and clubs. You are treating me like a robber, somebody that deserves that kind of great crowd before him in order to restrain him. And of course, that was completely ridiculous. And so this is who is hanging next to Jesus. And it can be easy to read this narrative, and especially if you were living through this, to think that things have gotten out of hand and things are out of God's control. But what we find when we look at Isaiah 53 is that this was all according to plan. That this was the fulfillment of prophecy. In Isaiah 53, in verse 9, it describes the suffering servant, describes Jesus. And it says and predicts that he will be assigned with wicked men. Yet he's with the rich man in his death because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. In verse 12, it goes on to say in Isaiah 53, I will allot him a portion with the great. He will divide the booty with the strong, because he poured out himself to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he himself bore the sins of many and interceded for the transgressors. Notice again what it says, that his grave was assigned with wicked men. And in verse 12, he was numbered with the transgressors, even though he didn't deserve any of it. That what Isaiah is predicting is that the way his servant would suffer several centuries later in the person of Jesus is that he's going to be somebody who's completely innocent, and yet when he dies, he's going to be numbered with the transgressors. He's going to be treated as a horrible, wicked sinner, the worst of the worst, and that is exactly what we're seeing take place in the Gospels as we read of the crucifixion of Jesus. He takes the place of a wicked man. He's got wicked men on either side of him. And isn't it interesting that even these horrible, wicked men, they're even joining in, casting insults at Jesus. It says the robbers who had been crucified with him were also insulting him. The word there is blasphemo. You look at how all this happened, and how did Jesus go from having such this great following just a few days before, and now in this crowd you have everybody from the soldiers to the men being crucified hurling insults at Jesus. And I would argue what happened was that most of these people just got swept up in the moment. That they hadn't actually looked into who this Jesus guy really was. They hadn't listened to or considered the evidence. They just saw all the leaders and all the crowds lined up against Jesus, and they said, well, all these people must be right, and so they began joining in and hurling insults along with everybody else. And I think this verse, and this idea at least, applies just as much to us today. There are some people that when it comes to their evaluation of Jesus, they are just swept up in the rest of the crowds. To be clear, if he isn't who he claimed to be, if Jesus is not who he claimed to be, and the biblical account is false, then by all means, cast your insults. Say whatever you feel about Jesus. Talk about what a liar he was, or what a bigot he was, or how self-delusioned he was, or how foolish all his followers are. Because even Paul will tell you in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, if he's not who he said he was, then we of all people are to be pitied. Because look at what we're giving up in order to be followers of Jesus for these promises that we have put our faith in, and this man that we have put our faith in. So if it's not true, by all means, let us cast our insults. But if it is true, if Jesus is who he said he was, if he really did rise from the dead, and you have not investigated that claim, you have not considered or listened to the evidence, but have simply been swept up with the crowds and blaspheme him as a liar, now understand, we are accepting the judgment that will come. And so it appears when you put these accounts together, these two men are hurling insults. And we look at Luke's account, and we see the first thief there. And Luke specifically points out in verse 39 of Luke 23, one in particular criminal, that as they're hanging there, and all these other insults are going around, it describes one of the criminals in verse 39 was hurling abuse at Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." I mean, just imagine this scene. You got a thief hanging from a cross who's going to be dead within hours, and even he is hurling abuses at Jesus, mocking him in the same way that the rest of the crowds were. And that's when we see this stunning conversation take place. That it seems that, as Matthew described, both of them were hurling abuse and insulting him. It seems that perhaps the explanation here is that one of the thieves, watching everything taking place, watching how Jesus is handling all this, suddenly he has a change of heart. And he hears what the first thief says, and he rebukes him. So one is hurling insults from the cross, one is rebuking the other thief from the cross. And he answers this other thief, and it says he's rebuking him, and he says, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. but this man has done nothing wrong. That's amazing. And you break that down, and there's several thoughts. There's about 7 thoughts there that come out of that. I want you to notice, first of all, he rebukes that man for not fearing God. I mean, to reiterate, here is this thief, and he himself is within hours of death, and all he can do is hurl insults at the other guy. Has it not occurred to him that he is but hours from meeting his God? And for you and I, we might not be hours from that moment, but has it not occurred to us that we are all potentially but hours from meeting our God? And if not hours, eventually the day will come where we will breathe our last. Do we not even fear God? We're busy with our jobs. We're busy criticizing others. We're focusing on what everybody else is doing wrong. We're good at coming up with our own opinions. But have we ever considered that I'm really going to die? That is a certainty. And have I considered what that means for my life and what I should really believe and spend my time in this world doing and thinking about? He rebukes this man. He says, do you not even fear God? Because look at his own precarious position. He says, you and I are under the same condemnation. You know, who is this thief? Where does he get off? Hanging from the cross, this is somebody that was violent, was a robber, was a horrible criminal, and he has the gall to begin mocking what, if in his worldview is correct, is just another criminal. Does he think he's somehow better hanging there from the cross? Saying, well, at least I didn't claim to be the Messiah. Well, what did he do? He did something that was worthy of putting him there on the cross to begin with. And he's spending his time focusing on the other guy. And so this other thief, he rebukes him and says, you and I are under the same condemnation. He goes on to say that the difference between us and Jesus is that as we're hanging here, we actually deserve this. But if you were to ask this criminal who is hurling abuses at Jesus, could he even enumerate, give specific examples of the things that Jesus was doing wrong? He's trying to get this man to see how foolish he is. Who do we think we are? That we're suffering. And at the same time, Jesus also suffered, but understand, we deserve our suffering because of the sin and the condemnation that we are under because of sin. But when you look at the life of Jesus, what wrong did he do? What did he do to deserve the punishment that he was suffering in the place of somebody that was probably their friend in Barabbas? And so that's what he rebukes him for, not realizing that this Jesus was innocent. And so what this amounts to, again, is this second thief clearly has a change of heart. And that's where the conversation gets all the more interesting. And he turns to Jesus, and he makes this request. First of all, he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And I don't think we appreciate just how profound that is. Because here's a thief, a wicked man hanging from a cross, and he is defending Jesus when nobody else would. He's actually dying with Jesus when nobody else would. Didn't Peter say, Lord, I will die with you, but where was Peter? Scattered. And we see that John is there, but it appears by all accounts that John is remaining silent. But here is a man of all of Jesus' followers hanging on the cross, experiencing the last hours of his life. And what does he do? He speaks up and he defends Jesus. Just this lowly thief. And he makes this remarkable request when he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. You know, imagine that you're serving, you're a waiter or something at a restaurant. and you're serving maybe Elon Musk, and who knows how much Elon Musk is worth. He's worth multiple billions, right? Maybe 100 billion or more than that. He has several companies. And imagine that you spill water all over Elon Musk's lap and you say, sorry, sir. And then you go on to say, hey, just remember me in your will, right? Just a couple billion and I'd be just okay with that, Mr. Elon Musk. If somebody overheard you, we'd say, how rude is this guy? What has he done to deserve to be in the will of Elon Musk? He hasn't done one thing. In fact, all he did was spill his drink all over him. The audacity, the magnitude of the second thief's request, I think, is often lost on us. This man has not taken one step for the Lord. He has not followed the Lord. He wasn't with him for 3 years the way that the 12 disciples were. His feet are currently nailed at the cross. His hands are nailed to the cross. What left is there for him to do but ask God and seek God to have mercy and grace on him? Who does this guy think he is? And the conversation gets even more interesting there, because that's when Jesus replies. He doesn't reply to the abusers. He doesn't reply to all those who are mocking him. But he replies to this man who spoke up, who defended him, who simply, his feeble request to Jesus was, just remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus turns to that man and he says, truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. In 13 words, 13 in English, 10 in Greek, Jesus captures the essence of God, the gospel, and the hope that we have. And you just break that down. Notice what he first says. He says, truly. This is something that he is emphasizing. This is something that you can count on. This is a promise. This is something that you can trust. And he says to the man, I say to you. Notice the personal nature of this promise. He's speaking to this man as an individual. I say this to you. This promise is for you. And then he says today, which means that this promise and the fulfillment of it is going to be immediate. There's not going to be any purgatory. There's not going to be any waiting. He says, today you shall be with me, which is highlighting the ultimate relationship. The only one that will matter in the end. This guy probably ruined every relationship that he had throughout his life, and his life of robbery. But he had a relationship in the end with the only person that mattered. And that turned out to be his Savior, Jesus Christ, who was getting ready to enter into his kingdom. And finally, Jesus says, you'll be with me in paradise. Just a few more hours of suffering. This man opened his eyes in paradise. And it's been said before, I don't know what preacher said it, but you can imagine him, I don't know how that works when you get to heaven, but you can imagine him waking up and he's surprised. How did I get here? Maybe the angels are like, how did you get in here? And the famous line is, the guy in the middle told me that I could be here. That's the gospel. That's what the gospel of Jesus is all about. And that is his response to this horrible, wicked thief of a sinner. And I want you to notice, just as significantly, the lack of a response that Jesus offers to the other thief. This man was talking to Jesus. He was hurling abuse. He was saying things to him, surely more things than what are even recorded. Luke probably just gives us a snippet of what was being said to Jesus from that man on the cross. There's no response by Jesus to that man. The only one that Jesus responds to is the one who calls upon Jesus in faith. After he had defended him, after confessing his guilt, his unworthiness, after acknowledging Jesus' righteousness, after contritely making a request for grace. And so when we look at the cross and we look at this scene, we find really three crosses, don't we? First of all, we see the one in the middle, and that's what we might call the cross of redemption, where Jesus is dying for the sins of you and me. And then we find the first thief, who represents the cross of rejection. Even in his final moments, when he should have been most desperate and fearing God most, he chooses to mock Jesus, reject Jesus, instead of accepting Jesus. And then finally, you got the cross of reception. This man, for those of us who are Christians, represents every single one of us at the cross. Because it's at the cross that we realize we deserve death. But Jesus is offering life. And so we seek mercy. It's interesting, Jesus doesn't just let us off the hook and say, okay, I'll let you start at zero again. He gives us paradise. And we receive hope and grace as a result. I want you to know that if you're here this morning and you cannot identify yourself with one of these thieves, that what you might as well be saying is that Jesus didn't need to die for me. That I'm okay just as I am. But you know as well as I know that deep down inside, we're wretched sinners in need of a Savior. And I want you to know there's relief in that. That we don't have to play the game. We don't have to pretend like we got it all figured out. One of the few prerequisites to being part of God's body, I'm a horrible sinner. What a relief that we don't have to be perfect and keep up appearances. Hopefully, as we look at the cross, we will not be mere spectators of the spectacle on the cross, but be participants in what is going on. And make this request that Jesus makes when he says, Jesus, remember me. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, this verse is often used to refute baptism, which is interesting because the man on the cross wasn't commanded to be baptized. Imagine if he was. Well, you'll be with me in paradise if you can get yourself off the cross and get into some water. He wasn't commanded that. But I want you to notice in Romans 6, where we become participants of the cross, in Romans 6 and verse 3, he says, do you not know that all of us have been baptized into Christ Jesus, were baptized into his death? We were buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. The thief on the cross wasn't commanded to be baptized, but you and I are. And I would submit that's much easier than what that thief on the cross did that day and what he lived through that day. We have a body of water behind us in the baptistry. We can go into the Gross Lake, Arkansas if you want. Wherever you want to do that, you can become a participant. And this promise, today you'll be with me in paradise, that also applies to you the moment we move from being spectators to participants in the cross of Jesus. And the one last thing that I'll mention, we often make a lot out of the Apostle Paul's life and that claim that he makes that he is the chief of sinners. And we often say that if Paul could be forgiven, couldn't I be forgiven? And I think all that is well and good and true. There's one thing Paul often says throughout his ministry, and that is he did all these horrible things persecuting Christians. He did it in a clear conscience. He didn't know that what he was doing was wrong. And that doesn't excuse the fact that it was still sin. But I would plead with you and make the same statement about the thief on the cross. Here is a man who was a horrible, wicked sinner. And it's almost certainly the case that he knew exactly what he was doing when he was doing it. And I want you to notice how readily Jesus forgives this wicked thief. Will he not also be willing to forgive you? He will. If you want to be baptized at this time, or if you have any spiritual needs, perhaps we can pray for you. I'll be standing in the back, and we can talk while we stand and sing the song of invitation, No Tears in Heaven. No tears in heaven, no sorrows